Hello my fellow gnomes, welcome back to the channel. Now today I want to talk about game design mistakes. Now this is kind of coming off the back of the GnomeJam I recently did, my game jam development contest. And doing that I played a lot of games and I see a lot of things that they're not perfect, and so I'm going to be using these to talk about things that I think we can all improve on. So I'm not picking on these games, these are mistakes that I've made, I'm sure loads of the viewers have and pretty much everyone has made. But I think the Game Jam's work is quite a good case study to look at different games. So the first thing I want to really dive into is this idea of, I think some games are worried about their games being too easy, right? They're worried, oh, if the game's too easy, then players are going to get bored, you know, the engagement's going to go down and people aren't going to play the game. But I want to challenge that one actually, because I think that if you take many really successful and popular games, say GTA, The Witcher, right, many of these games, and let's say you made the enemies one-hit kill, right? I think those games would actually still be pretty fun to play. For instance, in GTA, I would happily just jump in a car and drive around and play through the missions. There's a good story there. So it's not so much the difficulty. Because if you take the difficulty away, then yeah, maybe the game is going to be boring to some extent, but there's other ways you can add that engagement back. However, if you make your game too hard, really that's just acting as a quit moment. If there's something that the players can't get past, then more than likely they're just going to leave the game and they're not going to rejoin. Whereas if it's too easy, you can add things to keep them engaged. Take something like Pet Simulator, right? There's not really any difficulty curve there, but players are always engaged to keep going because there's some next milestone that they want to reach. So I think that's always worth remembering is don't think too hard about difficulty, but more about how you can keep your players engaged. And then continuing on the theme of engagement, the first few minutes of your game are so important because that's going to decide whether people want to keep playing your game or they get bored and they leave. So for instance, in my game Teddy, when you get in and you click the play button, you get taken straight into that round. You don't have to wait around for the new round to start and the old one to end or anything like that. So a few games for the Game Jam, you have a long cutscene, and then to replay sections of the game, that's then locked behind the cutscene, so you can't even skip it. Furthermore, I saw one game, well, a few games actually, having a really hefty loading screen. They're trying to load every single asset, and maybe your game needs that, but really you don't want that on Roblox. One of the joys of Roblox is everything, well, one of the joys and downsides of Roblox is everything is streamed in from the server, right? It's a bit different to like a game you might download on your Xbox or on Steam, right, where everything's got to get loaded from a hard disk drive, and so often there is a lot of loading that needs to happen there. But with Roblox, you really don't want a loading screen. It's going to put a lot of players off, and you want people into the action as soon as possible. Play any of the front page games and you'll see you get in pretty quick. If you're waiting, I would say more than 5 seconds to load into the game, certainly on desktop. I mean, obviously on mobile, you're at the mercy of your broadband connection speed, but on desktop, if you got a good Ethernet connection, if you're waiting more than like 5 seconds, 10 at absolute most, then your game's toast. For GnomeJam especially, it's always tricky because people want to add in a little bit of story. So one game I played, right, they're trying to kind of set the scene, little bits of like text and stuff to tell the story, but it ended up, I was like 5 minutes into the game and I'm thinking here, well, where is the gameplay, right? You've got to get that gameplay in a little bit earlier so you can tell people what your game is about, because ultimately you want to make a game, right? Not just a visual novel. The best way of doing this, if you need to explain things to players, is have some kind of interactive tutorial. This game did it pretty well. Or you sort of have the exposition happening during gameplay. So this game, it has a little NPC that sort of walks along with you and it explains the game as you go, which I really like. Now, one of the challenges of gnome jams and just game jams especially is you're up against a lot of people, you've got limited time, and you really need your game to stand out. And sometimes a bunch of people are just going to have the same idea as you. So quite funny, loads of people wanted to have a game or story where it started or revolved around the player waking up out of bed with an alarm clock. So I think, how many games have we got here? Like at least half a dozen games all had this very similar sequence. So really try not to be too cliche with your game if you can. And if you are, then try and take it in a slightly novel direction. For instance, this game took the bed and then it started fighting us, which was pretty fun. And then this one, we were using it as a weapon. So, you know, try and mix it up if you can. Otherwise, your game kind of ends up feeling like we've played it before. Of course, sometimes you will just come up with a cool concept, like having a fish out of water. So these were like reverse sort of underwater levels where you had to return to the water to keep your oxygen health up. And 2 people made that game, right? You can't always predict everything. And then if you're going to try and remake a popular game, so like Five Nights at Freddy's, we had 3 different versions of that at least. You need a way for that to stand out. And that's not to say that you can't reuse something, right? You can totally have another game that uses the same idea. People have this idea, oh, well, it's already been done, can't do it. But if that was the case, then we wouldn't have multiple shooters, right? There's so many games that are FPS type things where you shoot the enemy. But all of those games offer slightly different qualities, right? Maybe it's a story element, maybe it's the recoil of the gun, maybe it's just how the game's levels are designed, or how the game looks. So if you're doing Five Nights at Freddy's, is your monster going to sort of have some new iconic look to it? Maybe the movesets are different, and maybe how the game looks plays different. For instance, my game, Teddy, you know, it is using that same mechanic that we see in Piggy, in Granny, in Puppet, all these kind of games. But the idea of a teddy bear makes it stand out a little bit, and then the levels, people obviously like to them, they find them enjoyable to play, and so that's what gives it that slight edge in terms of having a unique IP. And then I do want to talk about horror games next. Now, I am a big fan of the genre, but I do sort of have a pet peeve, which is that having too much darkness in a game is not scary. Now, in the real world, if we're in a dark room, then that can be quite scary, right? The unknown. But the problem with a game is we're just looking at a screen and it's 2D. It's not really spooky anymore. It's just frustrating, right? We're just staring into nothingness, and if anything, it distracts and makes it less immersive because suddenly you become more aware of the rest of our surroundings rather than looking at what's on the screen. So really try to avoid having the game too dark. If you want to have a flashlight to your game to sort of make things look spooky, that's something you can do. Don't give a flashlight if it's not needed. Sometimes a game will just give you one, but the lighting's fine. But if you do have a flashlight, you've got to make sure it really feels and plays well. So one game I saw, the flashlight was sort of locked to the height that you looked at, which is obviously a big problem because you want to be able to look up and down with a flashlight and sort of shine at stuff. And then something that can help with darkness, I've noticed, is if you're in a room with lots of objects, so you can create shadows against stuff, then it creates much more a sense of space and sort of spookiness, because it's like, oh, what could be behind this next object as you move, rather than it just being some empty expanse of darkness, which personally I don't feel actually adds to the spookiness, and it just kind of takes you out of the experience. Now, in the game jam we've just done, loads of people did have some really cool uses. So they had 2 random assets and they had to add it into their game, and there were some really interesting applications of that. So one I saw was a tennis racket that acted as a laser gun. Not sure why, but it did. We then had like a sanity restoration system using a tennis racket, a bear bin as a robot controller, Mario Tennis, but Mario is the ball, and then bats as bullets for guns. So all sorts of crazy stuff going on. But sometimes crazy can be fun. For instance, I played a game with Albert Einstein, sort of as like a 2D picture that you had to fight. The game didn't make any sense, but it was great fun to play. And sometimes that's how it goes. Now, other times you'll try something and it doesn't quite work out. Now, if you're making a bigger game, then obviously you need to get that right. But for a game jam, I often appreciate that. So I saw a game that was about surfing. The mechanic, it was a bit broken. It didn't really work, but I like what they were trying to do. The same, there was one for like a coconut drop thing, a strategy, Age of War type clone, and then for more complex stuff too. But I like when there's that seed of an interesting idea, even if they haven't been able to execute it. But honestly, if you want my #1 tip for improving your next game, and especially your next game jam entry, is please disable the force field of the spawn location. So many games, they have the little force field that appears when you load in, and that breaks immersion so much, especially if your game is first person, because you see all this weird glittery stuff in front of your eyes before you can actually play the game. So disable that, and you'll be well on your way to making a hit game. So this is really just my rambling thoughts on game design based on some of the game jam entries. So to summarize, 1, try and ensure that you have gameplay there, right? Don't get bogged down in exposition and explaining things and adding story. Make sure that you do have gameplay, not too much loading, and it is there early on. Second thing is make it interesting, make it fun to play. So lots of times you can have lots of like fancy lighting and effects, but is your game actually fun to play, right? So if a very basic obby has actually got more gameplay than your game, then you've got a problem there. Make it fun. And if you're trying to reuse a similar concept, make it interesting, do something slightly different. And 3, disable that force field on the spawn location, please. Hopefully that helps you guys. Just kind of some ramble thoughts. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye!